My name is John Sun, and today I will be discussing my research titled John Adams, Defending Enemies, Dodging Controversies, Setting Precedents. My faculty advisor is Dr. Justin Carroll. My research explores the reasons why John Adams, who we all know as a very prominent patriot, chose to defend the British soldiers who were involved in the Boston Massacre. It also explores whether or not his decision to do so had any subsequent influence on his approach to law and government in the United States. So if we look at this picture, which is an engraving done by Paul Revere of what he calls the Bloody Massacre in King Street, we see a group of British soldiers led by an officer cruelly shooting into a Boston mob. We see people bloodied and laying on the street. And if you view this incident as the Boston Massacre, you do see a British officer telling his soldiers to unleash their muskets upon this Boston crowd with a murderous rancor. And 5 people were left killed, 8 people were left wounded. However, if you were a loyalist or you looked at it from the British standpoint, you may wonder what happened. Well, maybe these British soldiers were in fear for their lives and safety after they were attacked with thrown ice and snowballs and sticks and clubs, and perhaps they fired in self-defense. Actually, a club was thrown, it hit one of the soldiers who then discharged his musket, leaving his comrades to do the same. And they were admonished by Captain Preston, who said, "Why did you fire for?" And he struck the muskets of the soldiers to get them to hold their fire. Regardless of what version you believe, Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers were arrested and charged with murder after this event. So which version really happened? And who would defend these British soldiers? At this time, there was a lot of raw emotion in Boston, a lot of anger, and in this vitriolic setting, it was very hard to find a defense attorney for these soldiers. In fact, a number of British lawyers had already turned them down. Robert Auchmuty Jr., who was a loyalist, and Josiah Quincy Jr., a Whig, both agreed to accept this case if John Adams would be a co-counselor on the defense side. But again, why would John Adams, a patriot, accept this case as the defense attorney? And so what I wanted to determine is why he would do this. And also I wanted to look at whether or not this decision in any way, shape, or form influenced how he viewed law and government in his later career. To do so, I investigated primary sources, John Adams' diary and letters. I looked at a collection of his essays called A Defense of the Constitutions of the United States, which addresses various state constitutions. There is a pamphlet titled A Short Narrative of the Horrid Massacre in Boston, which describes this event from the Boston colonist standpoint. The British standpoint was represented in a similar pamphlet titled A Fair Account of the Late Unhappy Disturbance at Boston and New England. There's a collection of letters by John Adams titled Thoughts on Government, which is exactly what it is. He describes what he feels would be the best form of government for the United States. He got a chance to put this into practice in 1779 when he was elected to join the Massachusetts Constitution Convention. I looked at some secondary sources as well. These include textbooks, peer-reviewed journal articles, historical reviews, and law review articles that address whether or not his decision and his actions had any effect on criminal law, as well as various biographies about John Adams. So what did I find out? Well, firstly, I wanted to investigate what John Adams had to lose by accepting the position of defense counselor. John Adams had a thriving law practice as he was a leading attorney in Boston at the time, and he also had a very promising political career ahead of him. Also, at the time, his wife Abigail was pregnant. He was certainly concerned about what the effects of this case would have on his career, his earning potential, as well as his family over the long term. So why did he do it? Why did he take this job? Well, at the time, he went to Harvard Law, and the colonial colleges and Harvard in particular were bastions of Whig and patriot thought. Most of Harvard's alumni, up to 85% of them, favored independence from Britain at the time. John Adams' education at Harvard also had a significant influence upon him. At the time, at Harvard Law, at Harvard College in general, they were debating topics such as, does civil government originate from a compact? Or should kings just govern as they wish? They also asked the questions whether subjects are, quote, bound to observe the mandates of kings unless they themselves keep their agreement with their subjects. However, this teaching was tempered by reason and logic and the teachings of Plato and Aristotle. And perhaps it's this emphasis on logic and philosophy that influenced Adams to focus more on the law and jurisprudence over the raw sentiment and emotions that were happening in Boston at the time. John Adams was also a very reserved patriot. He believed more in the rule of law than the rule of the mob, and he actually opposed the use of violence to protest British taxes and policies. He also did not believe that America and American colonies should force independence, but rather he believed that as America grew in population and economy, that independence would happen naturally. In fact, at the Continental Congress, Adams actually proposed a compromise where Parliament would be given oversight over trade as a conciliatory gesture. And up until 1775, Adams actually felt that reconciliation was possible and really didn't fully embrace independence until then. So because of these reasons, maybe Adams was more likely to take this case on because of his moderate stance towards Britain, his slower and more reluctant acceptance of the need for independence, and his rejection of violence as a form of protest against the Parliament, and his belief in the rule of law and order over mob justice. Adams said, quote, "Every lawyer must hold himself responsible to the highest of all tribunals," unquote. So although he faced criticism for defending and representing the British soldiers, John Adams served as a defense counsel because he believed in a fair trial, due process, and the rule of law. So what happened during the trial? Well, it's really interesting. He introduced the concept of reasonable doubt and due process, and also this concept of being innocent until you're proven guilty. In fact, he reminded the jury that it is, quote, more beneficial that many guilty persons should escape unpunished than one innocent person should suffer. So as a result, Preston and 6 soldiers were found not guilty. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter. They pleaded for benefit of the clergy, were branded on the thumb, and returned to Britain. What were the ramifications for John Adams after the trial? Well, Boston had a long memory of this incident, and many felt that he should not have taken the case on. In fact, in 1815, Adams said, quote, that he was made to feel like he was an enemy to my country. He actually risked his professional reputation, his political career to be able to defend Captain Preston and the 8 soldiers. This caused him to lose about more than half of his legal business. And he also said it, quote unquote, destroyed my popularity. He received very little compensation for being the defense counsel for this trial, but he remained very proud of his role in the Boston Massacre trials and felt that his defense of the British soldiers was, quote, one of the most gallant, generous, manly, and disinterested action of my whole life, and one of the best pieces of service I ever rendered my country, unquote. Did Adams apply his principles, ideals, and ethics later on, or did it remain in this trial? Well, actually, in John Adams' Thoughts on Government, he strongly believed that, quote, the very definition of a republic is an empire of laws and not of men, unquote. He wanted to separate the judicial, legislative, and executive powers, and he strongly believed they should not exist in one governmental body. If it did, the country would be governed by, quote, arbitrary laws, unquote. He also believed that the judiciary should be independent and that Judges should hold their positions for life so they would not be beholden to others for their jobs. He had a chance to put this into practice. In 1779, John Adams was Braintree's delegate to the Massachusetts Constitutional Convention. At the convention, Sam Adams and James Bowdoin asked him to draft the state's constitution. He actually applied a lot of these principles. He made sure that, again, there was a separation of powers. There was an independent judiciary with the Supreme Court, judges in Massachusetts serving lifelong terms. He also made sure that there was the ability to seek legal remedy and recourse and to, quote, obtain right and justice freely and without being obliged to purchase it, unquote. It guaranteed a trial by jury and a verification of facts in clinical in criminal trials, included a right to counsel, presumption of innocence, and due process and reasonable doubt. I thought this was a very, very interesting project for me. I originally had a very negative impression of John Adams because of his role as a Federalist in this Federalist versus Anti-Federalist or Democrat-Republican Party, as well as his support for the Alien and Sedition Acts. And so for me, he was a unknown or maybe even an ignored president. But yet what I discovered during my research was that he developed a very model of government and also criminal law that we use in this day and age. This was my first research on older American history, and I was challenged to understand how I can find primary sources for this. So it was a great learning experience for me. And the last thing is I think it really exhibits this concept of silence, where I found very scant data on how the British soldiers felt, but a lot of data on what the Bostonians thought. And I really feel like this exemplifies a lopsided power between what was going on at the time. I wanted to thank Dr. Cowell for his support, teaching, and mentorship, and to Dr. Cooksey and the Student Research Day for allowing me to present today. And there'll be references if you want available on request. Thank you so much.